Welcome to The Technology Pill, a podcast that looks at how technology is reshaping our lives every day and exploring the different ways that governments and companies use tech to increase their power. My name is Gus Hossain, and I'm the Executive Director at Privacy International.
And I'm Caitlin, and I'm PI's Campaigns Coordinator. Hi.
I'm Carla Prudencio, Advocacy Officer at Privacy International.
Carla, thanks so much for joining us today. I am actually very excited about this edition because although PI has been working on the issue of competition and big tech for a while, it feels like something deeper is happening. Something deeper and more challenging to the idea that we can actually control the power and the size and the reach of big tech. And that is the emergence of vertical mergers. So, Carla, if I could just start this entire thing off by asking you to help our listeners understand what is a vertical merger and why are we so excited about them?
Yeah, of course. A vertical merger or a vertical integration, we also call it, occurs when one economic agent or one company, a big company, owns different parts of the supply chain. For example, let's think about oranges, right? Like you can have like a market that focus on producing, going to the camp, having those oranges, but also you will own the trucks that deliver those oranges to the supermarkets, and you will also own the supermarkets, right? So you have different markets there, and you own all that chain from production to the consumer. So usually these kind of mergers are not problematic, or regulators don't seem to mind a lot because they see that in each market you have different competitors, right? So in the producing oranges, you have some competitors there, some other farmers that are doing that. Also in the trucks, you will have some people that it's delivering, and some of them will offer like lower prices and you will go with them. And also you have a lot of different supermarkets. So they don't seem to care about these kind of vertical integrations because you are having a lot of different markets, and those markets have their own like strategies and definitions, right? But in this specific case that we will start like talking about, we are exploring a very specific market, which is the big tech one, right? Big tech companies, as we have been studying in PI and in this competition stuff, we usually define their market as a content market, kind of like where they are competing is delivering specific content to users or to people that it's in the internet. So for example, Facebook or Google, they have their own market and they are competing with others in that. What is happening here is that they started to open that and try to integrate vertically and own more like of those different parts of the market. So they need to own other layer, and the layer that they are trying to reach out now is the infrastructure. How? For example, owning cables or owning antennas or owning satellite internet. They are trying to not only delivering content, but also own where or how you deliver that content.
I'm not sure if I quite understand, like, what's the virtue of no longer being a free rider in this entire business?
Let me explain a little bit more context. They are not necessarily competing with traditional operators or traditional telecom companies in big cities. They are trying to compete, or they're trying to reach some underserved areas or some remote areas where the market hasn't arrived yet. So why? Why do they want to do this?
It's a nice thing to do, right?
Yeah,
it bridges the so-called digital gap, and yeah,
sounds really nice. But as like in a business perspective, it doesn't make any sense, right? Because like even telecom operators are not reaching that market because it's not good for them. They know that it's always places very remote with hard conditions to connect, but also with low density of population. So they won't be able to charge much for the service. They will have only 100 clients and they will be in the mountains. So they will have super difficult conditions to connect those peoples, right? So for them, it doesn't make sense to do that. And the states are trying and pushing them like from forever to go there, and they are like putting some specific regulations in order, okay, I will give you this license, but you need to go to the Amazon and connect some people, and you have like these obligations to do it. But we know that almost half of population in the world is not connected now, so it's not working. But then the big tech companies come and say like, okay, for me it works, right? And the first like answer that everyone gives is that for them it's good because they will have more clients, right? And this is why when you study vertical mergers, you need to be like aware of these kind of situations. For them, they already reach like all the people that is connected, but they know that they have a lot of potential consumers all over the world and they need to reach them. And the way to do it is, okay, let's invest in infrastructure. Infrastructure won't be our main like business. We won't win money there. So we will be in the same situation of a regular telecom company. It's not worth it, but we will win something. So they will win some users in their platforms, and they will also they will have a lot of data, and they will have a lot of information about these specific areas.
That's right. So they were winning to begin with. It's just they ran out of places to win in. Exactly. So now they're adding new places. I like the way that you present that logic. It makes much more sense to me why investors in these companies see the remote areas of the planet as exploitation opportunities in a way that telecommunications providers, investors wouldn't. It's a different mindset, and it's a faster path to making money, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is. And it's like something that we need to explore pretty closely. But in PI, we're also asking like, oh, this is not necessarily enough for us, like to understand the issue, right? Like it makes sense. They are winning more. And in this case, I wouldn't say this is something problematic. I mean, there's a failure in the market, or what the telecoms operators have called like a fail on the market. And they are trying to fix that, right? It makes sense. They are bridging the gap. They are going there. They are connecting people. But as we are always saying and trying to explore, like what is the underlying reason, like something more profound that they want to achieve? And if they are like overreaching their power, which is something that we also been exploring and analyzing, because having this type of market, which is very different as the orange market, because we are dealing with a kind of human rights market. We are dealing with an essential service for a lot of places, like water or electricity. So when you are owning that essential service, you also have a lot of power.
Being old enough to remember the concept of the digital divide and reducing the digital divide was like almost a noble purpose, which was there was this really empowering thing called the internet that people across the planet deserved to have access to, and that access to the internet was a right. But when you see it in the context of these very same companies that spend all their time turning the internet from this noble ideal to this exploitable infrastructure where the data is what fuels them, like it feels like that they're bringing a very different internet to these communities. And I remember having a conversation with one of our dear colleagues at a Colombian human rights organization who was recounting that in certain parts of Colombia, the telecommunications system, like the only way that people communicate or use the internet as they know it is over WhatsApp. And that kind of just blew my mind that, well, first of all, there's whole parts of the world where the internet is only known to be end-to-end encrypted, that's kind of neat. But then you start to realize, but hold on. This is a company that is owned by a bigger company. And that bigger company, its business model is to exploit data the moment they can get access to it, which fortunately with end-to-end encryption, they don't have access, but this is not where it's going to end for a company like Meta. And so, yeah, it does feel like if this was the year 2000, you would almost think that they're doing the Lord's work of making access available to people. But now it just feels so much dirtier. But I can't really explain that in a public policy kind of way.
But the thing as well is a lot of that feel-good, great stuff also came with a commitment to net neutrality, right? That all websites would be treated the same, but like internet services provided by, for example, Meta often come with 0 rating for Meta's own platforms, which means that if you're going on Facebook, then Facebook is free to you. Like it doesn't cost you the same way that going on like Google or other services would be. But how, if you're a government, how do you tell Meta, stop self-preferring your own service if the alternative is Meta go, okay, fine, that's the only reason to provide internet for us, so we're going to stop with our weird Zephyrs. They had Zephyrs for a while, didn't they? Like blimps that they were using to do internet.
No, that was Google was doing the blimp thing.
That was Google.
Yeah.
Google was the blimps.
That was a different type of dystopic future brought by a different company.
Yeah.
But like those governments are in a real bind, and it's not extortion, like by the legal definition, but
But you're nailing something there that I want to throw back to you, Carla. Not throw back to you, but I want to pass the ball back to you, which is like the world wasn't going to come to an end if all of a sudden we couldn't do a Google search. You know, it's not like that they were like the banks in 2008 or the car industry in 2008, where if they failed, the whole economy in countries or in regions would come to a grinding halt. But it feels like that this is the game that big tech is now playing, whether it is them getting into national security, as we've seen recently, where Facebook and Anthropic and other companies are saying, oh, we want to get into helping to defend the West, or they're getting into the financial sector more and more. And now they're getting in, as you say, they're getting into infrastructure. And so will a state that has a duty to regulate for the benefit of their citizens, will a state pick a fight with a company that is so powerful now that if they say, hey, we aren't going to play by your rules, we're going to shut everything down, they're too big to fail, right?
Exactly. I think you both are nailing like the point in different directions, right? Like one is what Caitlin was saying, which is like the power of regulation in these kind of situations where one company is providing a service that is essential for the area and they can leverage that saying like, okay, but I will do it on my own conditions, right? Because I'm the only one who can go there. And you are relying on me to bridging the digital gap and to put like some nice numbers out there of how your population is being connected and whatever. So you're relying on me. So I won't be regulated like the same as a traditional telecom company, right? And that has a lot to do with net neutrality, like a lot. And yeah, sometimes these initiatives are going against some laws, but sometimes not. Like some countries have really, really bad net neutrality legislations. And we need to be very clear of that. In Latin America, a lot of countries have legislations that allows that like one same provider can do this. Like it's something that they are not paying attention because everyone's saying that the net neutrality debate is like kind of old or dead or whatever. And it's not, like it's happening and it's very problematic. But what you're saying, Gus, I think it has to do with like something much, much bigger, right? And we need to be really aware that, as we were saying, like these companies have these, but they also have their other business. And they are also providing some content to the big cities. They are also influencing some conversations. They also want to leverage and have political power. And so they are using this market, which is like something, their, I don't know, philanthropic way of doing stuff to gain power in other kind of markets, right? And they have the switch. They can decide, okay, you don't like it, so I will shut off like the whole Amazonia. Or if you now go and see like a map of Africa and how Starlink is now the dominant player in a lot of countries and a lot of regions, you can see the power. Like they can say, okay, you want to regulate me in, I don't know, X, my platform, I will shut down the infrastructure. And that has happened. And we will talk a little bit more about that in the podcast, but that has happened and can happen again. A lot of these providers are not only connecting these underserved zones, but they are also providing infrastructure to governments, which is kind of crazy.
So can you introduce to us who we're speaking to next?
Yeah, so we will be speaking to Peter Bloom. Peter Bloom is the executive director of Rhizomatica, and he has a lot of projects in the Amazon region also, but like in different parts of the world, specifically working with community networks and local community connectivity initiatives. And we will also be speaking to Lua Cruz, which works and lives in Brazil. He was a Green Web Foundation fellow, and also he's a coordinator at IDEC. So he will be speaking specifically about his research in the Amazon region and the case of Starlink and what we can learn about these experiences.
That's great. So let's go and speak to them.
My name is Peter Bloom. I'm the general coordinator of Rhizomatica, which is a US-based nonprofit that works globally on communication and autonomy.
And can you talk a little bit more about Rhizomatica and why communication, why autonomy, and where do you work, and just expand a little bit more about that?
Yeah, so Rhizomatica, we've been around for over 10 years. We incorporated officially back in around 2017. And we've done a lot of work in different parts of the world. We started out working in Nigeria with communities facing pollution and violence due to oil extraction in their territories in the Niger Delta, and basically started working or sort of merging telecommunications and communications issues into the ongoing human rights and environmental rights situation going on there. Back in 2009, 2010, that's sort of how we got our start. We've been doing a project in Mexico for a long time. That's where I live now as well, working with indigenous communities who wanted to build their own cell phone network. So we've been doing that with them for the past 10 years or more at this point. So kind of getting hardware and software, open source, free software, et cetera, all that kind of whole package together so that people could own and operate a cell phone network in many, many different communities spread out through southern Mexico. And we've had a lot of work as well in the Amazon, working with very, very remote communities as well on connectivity and communication in far-flung remote parts of the Amazon in different countries like Ecuador and Brazil. We developed some technology called Hermes for secure long-range communications over HF radio. So in places where it's very, very difficult or impossible to get access to the internet or to any other pre-existing communication infrastructure, we have these magical devices that people can put up and talk to each other over hundreds of kilometers and send data to each other as well. And then we participate in other larger projects with other organizations that covers many, many countries in Africa, Asia as well, supporting what we have been working on for the last many years, what we call community networks, which are essentially bottom-up, community-led connectivity processes. Helping push the state of the art in that, and lots of policy and regulatory issues that come along with communities wanting to do that, and just kind of providing expertise and experience and building alliances across countries around that topic. So that's kind of like our main thing, is this kind of idea of bottom-up connectivity led by people in communities.
I actually think it's really interesting that you define your work as autonomy rather than working on connectivity, because like it's more than that. It's like going through what communities want and why they want it, and like trying to find the ways in which connectivity or like communication can be also part of other human rights. I mean, you said that you started like 10 years ago, and I imagine that at the beginning you were the only ones on the environment or like on the ecosystem, like going to these like super remote areas with certain populations. Do you think that the ecosystem has evolved from 10 years ago?
Yeah, sure. I mean, really, it's more like 15 years ago when we first started, back when we were doing work in Nigeria. How we got started there was smart. So we're talking like 2009 in sub-Saharan Africa, 3G enabled smartphones are like becoming a thing. That's sort of how we got into the topic, to be honest. We were doing more like, and coming out of the community and independent media movement, which when confronted with the internet at the time was kind of a boom period for that. Like easy, cheap video editing capabilities, the ability to put up a website and get your stuff out there, you know, the whole indie media movement and all these other things. This is before the big platforms had really taken over. So there's a lot going on in that moment that was super interesting. And like I said, it was more about helping people get the word out about what it is they were doing based on sort of the human rights work or political organizing or mobilizing work different social movements were doing and organizations and indigenous people were doing. And where we started fitting into all that was on the sort of technology side and on the connectivity side. So saying, look, all of a sudden we have these new channels through which we can spread information about what we're doing, new ways to use technology to organize ourselves, and also just beginning to like have conversations with people about putting up their own infrastructure. And really that's like where we ended up going, was on the infrastructure side, just because there wasn't a lot of other people interested in that or willing to do that. So there was sort of, a fairly well-established digital rights world even at that point, or at least, people aware that some of these issues, net neutrality and all these other things were going on. And we were sort of more like, well, what about the infrastructure? Like, what about the actual towers and cables and everything? How do we have a say? Not just a say, but like, how can we actually materially do something along those lines? And so that kind of pushed us into the world of telecommunications rather than the world of like internet, if that makes sense. So what I mean by that is the regulation and the companies that actually build the cables and put up the towers, and then the government and, supranational agencies that do the regulation of that space. So yeah, we kind of ended up being a lone voice for a while in some of those places. Again, pushing our agenda, which is just there should be more equity and fairness in this, and communities and people at a sort of more local level should be able to participate in this process and build and operate the types of networks that they want.
And why do you think that people weren't interested exactly like on infrastructure, and they were more interested like on digital rights or other things were like over the top layer and not necessarily like with cables, antennas and all that stuff?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's because it's hard. I think there's also like a level of digital activism that happens at the digital level. So actually being in places and interacting with people, you're just kind of forced to accept the reality on the ground, which is that usually what's missing is the infrastructure. So before people can even access any kind of online rights or digital rights or any of that, there's this barrier in place, right? And that barrier is that the fact that there's no infrastructure for them to access or to use, right? So how do you solve that problem? Honestly, it's from the beginning, it's always been a pretty practical, more than like an ideological thing, it's been practical. Like we're working with people who have challenges or are trying to do something, and they're bumping up against the fact that they're lacking in the basic infrastructure to do that, which again, you see in health, you see in sanitation, you see in all these other fields, safety and security, whatever. But in the case of communication, information, and all that as well. So as communities, as people started recognizing the usefulness of these tools, and beyond the usefulness, the necessity of having some of these tools like basic voice communication, basic data, and all of that, it became, okay, well, how do we solve this problem? And that's where we then get into this side of the activism in the space itself of communication and information and connectivity, saying, okay, there's like something is really broken about how infrastructure gets to places, who owns it, who controls it, how it's regulated. And it's not providing services to people that need them. And not only is it not doing that, but when people want to do it themselves, it's really difficult for them to do so.
Yeah, I understand. Like, why isn't the state the one providing the connectivity, or your activism like more focus on pushing the state and saying like, okay, you should go to these places and connect them and give them access to these essential services, or like something that is basic need?
Yeah, I mean, I think, look, the state, most of the places where we work, most of the globe at this point has been pretty well captured by neoliberalism, by sort of the state as the facilitator of private entities. And that's really the state that we're dealing with. Actual state-run connectivity where the government or whatever is going and doing the connectivity has its own problems. And actually what we see in a lot of rural areas specifically is failures over many, many years, at this point, decades in some cases, of government projects for connectivity. So one administration comes in, they're like, okay, let's connect all these places. They go, they put some sort of under-resourced satellite dish in, and then that breaks and no one knows how to fix it. And then the government changes and the new administration signs a new contract with some other company. So I mean, we internally always joke about, we go to the municipal building in some community, and you go out on the roof of these things, and it's just a bunch of abandoned satellite dishes. And it's sort of like a little historical museum almost. And you ask the people, oh, what about this? Oh, yeah. And, 1995, they came in, they put this one. And then that lasted for a year. And then they put this other one in 1998. And then in 2004. And so you just go through, I mean, you go anywhere in the world and you see this. So the real issue for us wasn't so much saying it is your responsibility to ensure that this happens. And what we're pushing for is that you allow there to be more involvement of people. If the state can pay for it, that's always great. And that's a whole line of work that we have going on around the state financing communities to build their own infrastructure, but really advocating for there to be new players in that. Because essentially what it was is the government saying, okay, we recognize that the market isn't going to handle this because the people in these areas are too few, or they don't have enough available income to pay for a normal connectivity service. So what we'll do is we'll subsidize a private company to go do that. And, there's all these lists of government contractors in different countries and so on and so forth. What there isn't is like a sustainability plan for these things. What there isn't is a way that they engage people to understand what to do if something isn't working. So they kind of create these huge top-down connectivity projects that then can't and don't continue beyond either the administration, or if something breaks, beyond whenever the thing breaks, which is usually pretty soon after it's installed, right? So that's kind of how we got in and started doing that activism. And then we're bumping into the fact that we would talk to governments. They're like, well, we don't have a way for you to participate. There's no legal means by which you can access spectrum. There's no legal means by which you can access ducts or poles to string fiber or cables. There's simply no space for you to participate. So that's how we began sort of scratching away at that problem over the years to say, look, this is ridiculous, that there's no possibility even for people to be part of this. And again, we do want to partner with the state in the sense that, yes, it would be great if they did things themselves. What we know is that generally, again, they're outsourcing that to private industry and all of the problems that entails. But again, there's no continuity. That's really where we said, look, there has to be some kind of continuity involved in this, where you can ensure people that they have internet or cell phone service or whatever it is today, that in 6 months they're still going to have it. And what's the reality on the ground that's going to allow that to be real, to actually happen? And that's really where there's no plan ever from anyone, unfortunately.
That makes sense. And you were saying like that private entities or like the market solutions were not helping necessarily, or they were not even interested on these communities 15 years ago or 10 years ago. Do you think that's a reality now? Like with the big tech companies starting to look at the connectivity market or starting to look to these zones like at something profitable? Do you think that has changed or not, or what is the role of these private actors now?
So basically what we've seen is that traditionally or before, the people that built the infrastructure were telecommunications companies, right? People that built fiber optic cables, people that ran cellular networks and built those networks, internet service providers, and so on. And then on the other side, there's tech platform companies, right? A lot of them from Silicon Valley and all these that we know about. There's been somehow a merging of those things in some ways that didn't really exist before. So before that kind of fusion or hybridization started happening, yeah, I mean, it was just like a straight up market, what they would call market failure, right? And what we would call a failure to recognize the market, actually, which is not the same thing, but that's a whole other conversation. But the issue was, okay, well, we, the cell phone company, happily will go if you can guarantee that there's going to be this many users with this amount of disposable income to pay so that we can make back the money on the investment of whatever infrastructure we're going to need to put in to connect these people. And that math just didn't work out, right? For them.
Mm-hmm.
And so again, you get back into this situation where it's like, well, if this is a priority for, development or for economic well-being, how can this not be somehow dealt with in some other way? And again, there's, universal service funds. There's all these different mechanisms by which money is provided or subsidies are provided so that these types of networks can expand. But even so, even when that's being financed for free by the people, by the citizens, many companies that build networks are just not interested. So what we start seeing some years later is other business models and other people that have different business needs say, okay, it's actually worthwhile for us to invest in this infrastructure so that we can get more customers. So what we start seeing is companies like, at the time, Facebook, now Meta, Google, Alphabet, very large tech platforms bumping into limits on who can access their services, right? So the way I always think about it is like, imagine you're the largest publishing company in the history of the world. You make books, right? And you've now gotten books to every single person who knows how to read. But the problem that you've encountered is half of the world's population doesn't know how to read. So then you start a literacy program because you want to sell more books, not because you care about literacy. And this is what we see with the big tech platforms. They start looking at the same problem that we're looking at and saying, oh yeah, okay, there's something that's not working here. But what we want to do is push our services further and further into areas where at the moment there's no infrastructure to get those services there. Services being their platforms, right? Access to Google search or to, your Facebook page or whatever. So those companies begin to actively develop and build networks. Some of that they're doing for themselves internally. So like if you look at the private infrastructure that's operated by the Googles and the Metas of the world, there's a lot of undersea cables, terrestrial fiber, all kinds of stuff that they operate just to move information between their data centers and ensure that it can get there. And them sort of freeing themselves as well from the telecommunications providers. Saying, no, we have so much money, we're going to build our own cables and ensure that our traffic can move around as easily as possible. And then they also get into this other situation, which is, well, we can just kind of build the cable out to this remote area and do this and do that. And then we'll actually have access to more people because more people will have connectivity. So they're not so much interested in them as paying telecommunications customers like a normal ISP or cell phone company or whatever it would be. They know that if the internet gets to a certain place, it's very likely people are going to use their services, which gets into all the whole monopoly side of the discussion or whatever. But at the end of the day, that does bear out. Like if you look at rural networks, I don't know, I don't have most up-to-date information on this, but talking to ISPs and other people that run networks, even in the sort of most far-flung places, once the internet gets there, something like 80 or 90% of the traffic is YouTube, people looking at their profiles on Instagram or whatever. So these companies know that if they can get connectivity to people, it's very, very likely that they'll become users, and then they can make their money in the ways that we know that they make their money.
But should we care about the internal motivations of these companies of doing this if at the end they are like achieving connectivity on these places? And if so, why?
What it means to be online has changed a lot, right? It's a very different thing than the early days of independent media hackers and activists like ourselves being interested in using the internet for like political organizing, to this massive whole entire side of capitalism having a way to continue propagating itself. So yes, I think we should, like, if you only focus on the issue as we have a connectivity issue, and then you don't unpack what it means for people to have connectivity and the good and the bad of that, then yeah, I think you're sort of missing the point. Is there some sort of like philanthropic motivation by these companies? I don't know, maybe. I mean, I'm sure that they tell themselves that. Like, we're helping these poor people that don't have a means to get online, and like that's a good thing. And that narrative not only exists, but is like very common, right? So it makes it look like what they're doing is like a fantastic sort of almost philanthropic thing. But again, yeah, what they're trying to do is get more people online so that more people use their services. And again, we know that those services and those platforms have benefits and have drawbacks. And in the places that maybe previously didn't have connectivity, those drawbacks might be different and might be even more dire, more serious. If people aren't ready for that, if they're not prepared, if they don't have the like digital immune system to kind of understand what's happening with their data, or even like internal dynamics in communities that start changing when some people have access to connectivity and others don't, or even communities that are now both online and all kinds of stuff starts happening. I mean, we see all kinds of really unfortunate things happen when internet connectivity comes in. Again, that's not to take away from the good stuff, but it does kind of like bring people into the realm of surveillance capitalism in a way that they maybe wouldn't be otherwise. But again, this is where it gets complicated, separating, the quote unquote tubes and pipes and airwaves that carry things, the infrastructure, versus what people are actually doing on that infrastructure. It turns into one big blob and it gets a little difficult to unpack what's going on and how to understand it. Because people that live far away from the center of power or whatever do require ways to be in touch with people in the city, do require ways to be in touch with their family members who maybe live in another country, do need to access government service. Like, these are real needs. The problem is that we now have these kind of like multi-purpose platform on which all of this is happening that exposes people to all kinds of risks and vulnerabilities as well. So it becomes extremely complicated to unpack all of that and really know which way to go or how to help communities prepare themselves, to confront those issues.
You mentioned some of the difficulties when kind of internet and phone connectivity and all things arrive in those communities, and I wondered if you could talk a bit more about kind of what you've seen.
Sure. I mean, I think like what we're facing is that, and again, obviously, when the same company owns the infrastructure bringing it to you, it's obviously even more likely that it'll happen. It's not the only reason, but people are getting a version of the internet in a lot of these places that's specifically limited sometimes. I mean, there are even examples where you could essentially have free data provided to you and paid for by Facebook in order for you to access a tailored version of the internet. People, were very upset about that. And in most places, that's kind of gone away. But even still, most like cell phone plans, at least here in Mexico and other parts of the global South, you get free, you're paying, but you get kind of unlimited access to WhatsApp. You get unlimited access maybe to YouTube. You have these things that are 0 rated, right? Mm-hmm. So my point here is people with less disposable income generally tend to have a more limited experience and a more like curated experience curated by big platforms, which again, just feeds more data to those platforms. So yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely problematic, and what I would think people that are listening to this podcast already recognize as like some pretty obvious ways due to the privacy concerns, due to surveillance concerns as well. And yeah, I mean, what are some things that we see? We see like inter-community conflicts spark up. Like I was talking to some people in the Amazon in Ecuador some years ago, and however it happened, they ended up getting internet into these two communities that basically were like 2 or 3 days away by boat from each other. They got on the internet, and then both of the communities like started having Facebook pages, and it started a conflict because essentially these communities didn't have that much contact with each other, and all of a sudden they could talk to each other whenever they wanted, and they were basically just like insulting each other all the time. Kind of funny, but also like a little scary when that turns into something real, which it does all the time all over the world. That's one example. We see a lot here in Mexico, for example, human trafficking increase from communities that get online. You know, young people being groomed, being trafficked, recruited through the internet, those types of things. We've been actually recently more aware. I mean, we should have been more aware maybe before, but as we've done more work in Asia, we've been hearing a lot about gambling, online gambling, and addiction to gambling, and it in some places really being extremely destructive. So if you can then now gamble from your residence without, you don't have to go anywhere, and you can just gamble all the time, that's at a community level is becoming a real issue in a lot of places. We're hearing about that from Philippines and Indonesia. So yeah, I mean, these are some of the different problems that we're seeing.
Moving away from the like dark side and just like trying to come back to your initial point around what you have been doing, can you talk a little bit more about why the alternatives, or like understanding connectivity as a right, as an autonomous right, can lead to different results? Like why this is an alternative and why does this matter?
So, I mean, the way that we look at it, and having done this now together with communities in a lot of different places, the first thing is really about increasing people's ability to understand what is going on and what is happening. What I mean by that is that in the city, we don't really think about the infrastructure. We don't need to think about it. It's just kind of there. It generally works. And we kind of just accept that it's there and we're going to use it. When you're faced with the challenge that infrastructure doesn't exist, but there's something that you want to do with that infrastructure, it forces you to think a little bit more about how that infrastructure is governed, how that infrastructure is sustained, who owns it, who operates it, for what purpose, why do we want to do this, why do we not want to do this? And I think that's really like the critical moment or moments or process by which people can actually imagine and do something different. And that was like the big hope of the internet back in the day, was this is going to be a platform, you know, a launch pad for creativity and interconnectivity and all that. And that was captured. And a lot of that beautiful stuff has gone away, right? Or it's much harder to access. So for the folks that are engaging at that level, it just provides a much more rich process, right? Where it's like, okay, we want to get to this thing where we can do something, but the tools to do that, we're going to have to figure out how we manage those. How are we going to pay for this? How are we going to manage it? And that, for us, opens up a space to talk about, well, how are we going to use it? And what are we going to use it for? And hopefully provides the possibility, at least, for people to have conversations about how they can take control of their life in digital spaces, which I think for us in cities is really hard. Because we're not starting from that point of
dealing with the issues,
or even just like, do I want this or do I not want this? Because we also, some communities are like, we think we want to do this, and then we talk to them and they talk to other communities and they're like, you know what, we actually don't want to do this. This is crazy. Like, this is going to end up, you know, making it so that the young people or community move out of the community, or that people stop speaking the local or indigenous language. And so in some places, they're like actively keeping this out. But again, based on informed and prior consent type of thing. Like, there has to be a process by which people can engage with the topic. And if they can start from, well, how is this thing, this service, this internet, this connectivity actually going to get here? And thinking through that and creating processes and structures within their community for that to happen, it then also sets up the possibility for all these other conversations around how we're going to use it. There's communities where they turn the internet off at night, right? Because they're just like, okay, we're done for today with the internet. Like, kids did their homework. It's 8:00 at night. We're done. Tomorrow it'll be back on again. Or there's a community assembly and they don't want people being distracted. They turn off the cell phone network that they run because they can, because it's theirs. And why not, right? So that for me is the richness of the work. And how do you actually engage people on these issues? And again, folks in these contexts are having to engage on these issues at a much lower layer of the internet, the actual physical part of it. And then from there as well, having to grapple with all of the other things that it entails. But those come together. There's no point in building it and all the blood, sweat, and tears and money that goes into that if you don't see a clear reason to use it, right? And then as you're starting to confront both the benefits and the challenges, you have some control over the infrastructure. You have some control over what happens. You have some way to mitigate somehow maybe the harms and uphold or promote the benefits, right?
Yeah, as I understand it, like it has to do with the process of why we're doing this and how we are going to do it. And also, as you were saying, about the control, right? Like to decide how do we want to live on this digital world. Do you think these alternatives, like the community networks or autonomous projects building infrastructures, are like still relevant, even if we have like Meta or Google trying to compete with them? Sometimes they are faster and have more money to do some stuff that some communities cannot do. So do you think it's still relevant to think about community networks?
I definitely think it's still relevant, especially from what we were talking about your last question. Again, if the binary is, does someone have access to the internet or not? Those companies and then their kind of affiliates and again, I don't know, the big news in our world over the past couple of years has been Starlink, right? And Google invests in. So if you look at who the institutional investors in, it's all the same people, right? So this company happens to have majority ownership by Elon Musk and that, but if you look under who the other investors are, it's Google, it's traditional satellite companies, it's Saudi investment fund. They're all the same. It's all the same people at the end of the day, moving money around between them. So they have billions and billions and billions of dollars to put up infrastructure, to launch thousands and thousands of satellites into space, to build thousands of kilometers of fiber optic cable. So if you just look at are they going to get more people connected than us? Yes, of course they are. They have vastly more resources than we do. There are other organizations and NGOs that do that, and that's great, good for them, but that's not really what we're about. What we're about more is, what do people want to do with these tools and how can we help them do that? And that's a different than, am I online or am I not online? That's about saying we as a community or a group of people or whatever are coming together and taking collective action to solve a need, right? And that need is whatever it is that's defined by those communities and involves somehow the use of digital communication technology.
And just one last question around this idea of, okay, you have this alternative in which what matters is the process, the actual needs, the control over data infrastructure, about everything, and even deciding if you want to be connected or not. And for doing this, what are the major challenges that you are seeing or facing?
There's always less money available than required to do the work, which I think is a chronic issue for any nonprofit organization or any collective doing this kind of work. When then also compared to the money available to these companies, it's ridiculous how little money there is. Look, there is another piece which is more about, well, how much do people even really care about this? What I mean by that is, we have been in situations when the community is sort of well, you can kind of offload this or third party this to someone and someone will magically take care of your connectivity needs, or you can do it yourself. Mm-hmm. There are some communities that are great, let somebody else do it. Why do we need to be involved in this? That's a challenge. And I think that if you really dig into it more anthropologically or psychologically, it gets back to larger issues of inequality and access to resources and injustices that are present in society as a whole and globally and in most countries and in, even between regions, where people say, my cousin in the city dresses like this and has a cell phone and has this, so I'm out in like the rural village. I want to be the same. That's cool. I like that. That seems easier. That seems more comfortable. That seems like a way to, project myself in the world. And so how does that happen? This is about, again, and the internet feeds into this as well, how people see images of the hegemonic culture and then want to aspire to that. And in lots of rural indigenous communities as well, where we've worked, there's cycles of that happening over time, starting all the way back from conquest and colonialism to, when did TV first come to the community? And correlating that when people start dressing differently or stop speaking their local language, and sort of all this sort of cultural and linguistic diversity that's slowly being lost due to the homogenization of culture and the homogenization of specific, economic models and all of these things, which are both imposed and also just kind of spread through media and our networks at this point.
Have you had much government engagement? Because PI for a long time has been very involved in and critical of the ways in which telecommunications kind of companies and telcos have been asked to or have decided to bulk retain huge amounts of data that they then are asked to, they volunteer to, or they're forced to hand over to governments. And I wondered if it's something that's popped up as something you've had to engage with, or governments have popped up and kind of asked about.
So when we're working on like the local network aspect of things, we pay a lot of attention to that issue. But at the end of the day, the whole concept of a network is that it's interconnected. So if you want to leave your network and talk to someone else's network, you're now opening up yourself to that kind of government level surveillance. We do our best to make people aware of that even if you control your local network upstream from you, there's really no way to know what's going on. Or you can at least assume that something not good is going on, as we've learned. And there are like organizations that work on circumvention technology that like real specifically focus on this. That's not really our path, but we have been working on these other ways of communicating that don't require the internet. So we have, I think I mentioned it earlier, this project called Hermes, where we basically said, okay, how can we build a network that doesn't rely on any other networks? Like, what would that actually look like? How can we do that? So if our network doesn't interface with anybody else's network, can we still move information and communication around over long distances? Because again, we're working in places with low population density that are far away from each other generally. So we kind of happened upon, rediscovered old technology in the form of shortwave radio, and started building on different attempts to move data over shortwave radio. So basically the like summary of that is you can now communicate, you can do email, you can send chats, you can send photos and stuff fairly easily through a system that we developed called Hermes between very, very distant points. And if you want to do that without that ever touching anybody else's network or the internet or whatever, you can do that. So that's interesting for organizations that are concerned about surveillance and security. It's interesting for people that just simply don't have a way to access the internet. So yeah, I mean, it's definitely something that we think about, but there is a global internet and there is, billions and billions and billions of dollars of infrastructure all over the world that when you decide to not engage with, things are a little clunkier and slower and harder to do. So this is, I assume Privacy International struggles with this as well, but it's like this kind of like Faustian bargain that anyone gets into when you connect. Like, I want to be able to talk to people. I want to be able to get this information, but it's very likely, I know the companies are taking all this and doing whatever with it, and probably the government is too. And it's just like, well, do I do it? Do I not do it? And it seems so far as a society, we've kind of just accepted that this is what it is, which is sad and is depressing sometimes. But how we move towards alternatives is the question. And that's like the big part of our work. And there's a lot of challenges involved with that. And it's not easy, but there are, places and situations and processes going on that do provide some counter to that overall, maybe not so bright sentiment.
Awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. I think it's really interesting, to have these alternatives in mind, because we are always thinking or talking about the negative impacts of big tech or what's happening there, without necessarily looking into the alternatives or what's being deployed by communities. And as you were saying, it's not necessarily those are two things that are against each other, because they are happening in different places. They are not necessarily competing, because what you want is different from what they want, right? So you want process-oriented transformation, you want control over this, you want thinking around results, around a lot of things, and they want money, power, and sometimes also a lot of control. Sometimes we are also worried it's not only that they want to have more customers or more money, but also they want to be as big as possible, because then it's too big to fail, right? No one's gonna regulate them, because a lot of digital public infrastructure is also relying on them, and even military services and stuff. So yeah, I think this is really interesting. Thank you for talking with us.
My name is Lua Cruz. I'm a Brazilian lawyer. I work at the Institute for Consumer Protection here in Brazil. So I coordinate the telecommunications and digital rights teams. And I was also a fellow with the Green Web Foundation, where I develop research on internet connectivity in the Amazon.
Okay, and can you share a little bit more about your research in the Amazon region, specifically regarding local connectivity? We would love to hear a little bit more about that.
So my research focuses on the challenges faced by people in the most isolated areas on the Amazon due to the persistent lack of comprehensive internet access. So this connectivity issue has been a long-standing problem in the region, which successive governments have failed to tackle adequately. So recently, however, we've seen new connectivity solutions emerge, include these alternatives aimed at addressing these gaps. So we have the community networks, but my study specifically looks at this low Earth orbit connectivity, which is primarily provided by companies like Starlink. And there's another part of my research that involves examining how this new form of connectivity is impact communities that previously had little to no access to the internet or were constrained by these very slow speeds. So this was also an exploratory study. So as I wanted to grasp whether any cultural shifts were happening in these newly connected areas, because there is this prevalent narrative, often amplified by the media, suggesting that criminal actors, such as illegal miners, are primarily using this connectivity via Starlink. So this element was really crucial to explore, to see the implications for the region and the communities.
So just to clarify, before Starlink, there was no connectivity at all, or they had some access. Can you explain how was it before?
Yeah, one of the people that I interviewed, he told me that went from 0 or 1 to 100, the quality, specifically because before Starlink, the connectivity in these places, they were slow, with low quality, really expensive, even when it's super low quality. So now it's a really revolution, not only because of the quality of the internet access, so it's really high speed, but also with the prices. So it's a really low price to have a Starlink antenna and to pay this monthly fee.
I mean, and I can imagine that it was really hard to go to these places and to provide some connectivity, and that's why it was underserved in that regard. But why do you think Starlink or any big tech would want to go to, for example, the Amazon region?
Well, there is the short answer. It's because these companies, they are drawn to the Amazon market primarily because connecting more people means more users, specifically on social media platforms, which in turn generates more personal data. And then this data is also available for target advertising, which is like the major revenue stream for these companies. So by expanding their user base, they not only gather more data, but also increase the opportunities for selling advertising space to marketers, which boosts their profits. So their interest in the Amazon region and other underserved areas in Brazil is largely about spending their user base and maximize earnings. And that's not something new, right? So, and not only that, there is a question of profiting from this database and users, but there is a thing related to Starlink that is really specific and specifically for Elon Musk, which is not only the financial gain, specifically because he doesn't need any more money. And that's why also that he doesn't charge a lot for the services. It's a political gain. So imagine that you have a whole area in a strategic area as Amazon, not only for Brazil, but for the whole world, connected through your devices and through your infrastructure. The power that you have over these people and over these communities is super large. And then you can use this as an advantage to make political movements. And that's not only happening in Brazil. We are seeing this happening in the war in Ukraine, and also in other places like in Sudan. There's a really battle on the use of Starlink. So if you have the control over this infrastructure, you also have a great control over the politics in those places.
You were talking at the beginning about like some cultural changes, some things that have changed within the communities. Can you expand a little bit more on that?
So this expansion, like in these remote areas, like the Amazon, they both present opportunities and significant challenges. So when I started the research, I was thinking only about the challenges. And there are challenges, but there's also opportunities. And this is something that is becoming quite clear for like people outside of the Amazon. And that's a problem because if this thing is giving them opportunities, it's way difficult to take away from them. So it provides much needed internet access, and it also brings this kind of social disruptions. And among these social disruptions, we are seeing excessive screen time among youth, increased exposure to pornography, and the spread of misinformation, and a specific kind of misinformation related to environmental issues. So these are particularly concerning in communities with limited digital literacy, where these technologies, they can and they are disrupting these traditional social structures and harm these vulnerable groups, especially women and children. Because one thing is when internet came to urban areas, like where we live, we already are like intertwined with this kind of changes and cultural shifts. But for this community specifically, this is particularly concerning because their way of living, it's what keeps the forests standing. So what's happening is that youth, they want to go to the centers, like to the capitals. They don't want to live there anymore. They don't want to do the hunting and farming. They don't want to take care of their communities. So it's really important because it's not something, we have internet, so they also have to have internet. And that's for sure. But the way that we have to deal with this arrival of internet in these specific communities is really different. And there's another thing which is often not mentioned, but it's because Starlink, they have like this plug and play model that does not create local jobs or any tech ecosystem. Unlike other technologies that we have also in the Amazon, like fiber optics, which generate like a local industry and this skill building, the Starlink just only foster this technological dependency, like leaving communities reliant on a foreign technology without developing the necessary infrastructure or skills for these communities. And finally, there's a problem because who are giving money to these communities to connect themselves? It's not the communities that are paying for this. That's the craziest part of that. There are major corporations like banks, agribusiness, and mining companies. They are financing the Starlink's expansion. And that goes back to what I was saying, because there are these fears that these companies may be using the connectivity as a means to advance their own economic interests, like eroding these land rights and the cultural preservation.
We always hear these narratives like as something that it's one thing or the other, right? You cannot have like the opportunities without those challenges. Do you think there's like something better in order to access to those opportunities, or they are getting what they can and that's okay?
So this is a complex question, but it's really important, specifically because that's it. Some people told me that this is the best option. And they are aware of that, including indigenous communities. They know who is like Elon Musk, and they know he has like his private interests. For instance, they know that he tried to coup Bolivia to get the lithium from there. They say people from outside, they came to us and say, no, you have to have autonomy or sovereignty. And now you're using Starlink, but they're saying, is this kind of connectivity that is really giving me autonomy and sovereignty? And we are aware of these like trade-offs. We are not like innocents. And that's the thing, like people think that indigenous peoples are innocent and they don't know anything about politics, but they are really well aware of that. And there's a thing also, this gap of connectivity, it just happened because the government didn't create other opportunities and did create infrastructure like an alternative. And why I'm saying that? Because in Brazil, we had like this kind of huge public policy that has been going for, I don't know, maybe 10 years or more. It's a plan to connect the Amazon region to the internet through fiber optics. There's being laid out on the rivers. So what happened? 10 years ago, we had a leftist government, and what this government made was to put this project under the army. So the army was responsible to put internet in the Amazon, but the army don't have the know-how to do that. So the project didn't went well. Yeah. Specifically because the army knows very well the Amazon, like geographically, but they don't have like the technical capability to run fiber optics there.
Lay down the code. Yeah.
And there is also this thing that when they put the fiber optics, it was only available on the headquarters of the army, not to the community. So they're only connected the headquarters. Yeah, that's it. And then after that, we had almost a decade of far right governments that don't care for indigenous rights and indigenous people. So we had like this whole gap. And now, like 2 years from now, a new government, the Lula administration, they took back the project that was under the army and put under the Science and Technology Office. And now they are laying out. But that's it. We lost like 10 to 15 years to do that. And people don't want to wait anymore because all this fiber optics probably is going to be laid out until, 2028. And people want to get connected right now. They need to access medicines, health services, job opportunities, educational services, public services right now. So for them, it's like that. Starlink is the best option right now, and we'll use that. And if something new shows up, we're probably going to use something like that. But right now, that's the only alternative. And there's also another thing. There is people saying, oh, what about community networks? Community networks are really amazing and they're really great, but they are not perfect. And they are not perfect because the problem is really huge. The gap is really huge in the Amazon. So community networks is really great, specifically in Brazil. I don't know about other parts, but they only address small communities and they don't have like this high-speed internet. Of course, they are a viable alternative if you don't have anything. But if you go to an indigenous community and ask them if you want a Starlink antenna or you want to build a community network, they probably want to have the best of both options because they want the high-speed internet and they want to have control about the use of the internet. And that's something that we are seeing right now. For instance, there are communities that have Starlink, which is a high-speed internet, but they have like hours to do that. So for instance, when you have like periods of religious ceremonies that last days, you can use that. You have like hours to use, so you can use after 8 p.m. or you can use in specific days, or if you have like a hunting day, you can use internet. So they are trying to understand how to deal with that. And that's something that really resonates with community networks, where you have some control over the infrastructure. They don't have control of their infrastructure, like they can't set up the antenna or the routers, but they can set up like these specific rules on hours and content.
It makes me sad because there's not a lot of options. I mean, this is the option that they have now. And it's difficult to say, okay, let's tell them not to do it, right? Like, especially because it's like patronizing and it's like thinking the communities do not have like these trade-offs in mind. But I'm also thinking about the role of the state in this situation. If they are not the ones like going there and putting fiber optic and doing the job, do you think that the state does have like a responsibility to regulate how this is happening, or like I don't know, like even Elon Musk, Starlink, and this kind of environment?
Sure, definitely. I think there's a problem also with the telco sector. I'll go back like a couple decades, like in the Amazon region. In capitals, like we have big capitals in the Amazon region. Like next year, one of the capitals of the Amazon region will host the conference of the parties, the climate conference. But the connectivity is primarily provided by these major telecom operators. Like in Brazil, we have Claro, Telefônica, and TIM. And then we have a significant number of smaller and local internet providers in these remote areas. However, these like smaller providers, they are able to meet the vast connectivity needs of the region. And that's why we're seeing like the popularity of Starlink in the Amazon. But what happens is that this limited role of the state in ensuring connectivity, it can be traced back to like the widespread telecommunications privatization that occurred in the 90s. So this shift led to the governments to believe that the private sector would eventually bridge this access gap. And this approach like persisted across multiple administrations, as I was saying to you, like leftist government or the right government in Brazil. They assumed that the telecom companies would bring universal access. However, like in remote regions like the Amazon, there's a high cost and low profit margins, and this make the area less attractive to this private company. And as a result, like the government, this heavy reliance on private providers left this significant gap. And that's why we are right now. And now we are like trying to solve the problem that was created like during many years, and it's not going to be solved right now. This is an issue of connectivity, but there's a responsibility of the state with, as I was saying, the cultural impacts that this kind of connectivity is making on these communities. But there's also another problem because, and this you can put on the podcast because I put also in my blog posts, I did my research and I talked to government officials. In Brazil, we have like a digital policy office. So I went to them and say, hey, I went to the Amazon. I was trying to understand the Starlink arrival, and I think you should do something on that. And the answer was more or less like that. Well, we have a lot of issues to tackle right now. So this is not really a priority for us in the moment because we also have a lot of priorities. The Amazon issue, it's a huge issue, especially for a country that is going to host a conference, the biggest climate conference, and receive this answer shows that the government is going to take some time to take a look on that, to act not only on the connectivity gap, but also on the misinformation and freedom of expression problems that will surface with these connectivities.
So if the state is not doing anything, community networks maybe are not like a viable or a feasible solution specifically there. And we have Starlink. How do you think this could be better? Or like, do you see some solutions or not really?
Yeah, we can think about some solutions. For instance, the rollout of fiber optics could be way faster. But it's not as easy as I'm saying, because put fiber optics in the Amazon River is not that simple, specifically for all the licensing that you need, because you're putting like this huge infrastructure, not only environmental licensing, but also heritage licensing. And not only that, like the Amazon River, it goes up and then it goes down. So when it goes down in droughts, it became really difficult to put the cable. So we have like a specific window of time to put that. But that's something that we can push for. And we are pushing, like, put this cable as soon as possible. Go. And that's one thing. And there is another thing that I believe it's really important. There is kind of a regulatory gap for the licensing of satellites as Starlink. And this is not related to the government itself, but it relates to the National Telecommunications Agency, which is an independent body. So, for instance, what happened right now? In 2021, Starlink paid only $20,000 for the right to operate the network over the country until 2027. And this is like a really small amount considering its financial capacity and the scale of its operation. And this fee structure, it was set by a regulation that allows companies like Starlink to avoid the typical public bidding process required for license. So the agency, it's called Anatel, it considered that a public auction unnecessary for Starlink, deeming the situation as one where multiple companies could operate satellites without a competitive bidding process, so thereby granting a clear advantage to Starlink. And there's a contrast because other companies that provides internet access, for instance, traditional telecom operators that, for instance, won 4G and 5G license, they had to meet a set of strict obligation as part of the auction process. Like they put millions and millions of dollars on that. And there's obligation also in these auctions. And these obligations often included like investing in public infrastructure. So the fiber optic cables that the government is putting in the Amazon came from the 4G and 5G auctions. So, and there's also other obligations like connecting schools, providing internet access to remote areas, and extending the coverage to these regions. So there is these counterparties that are designed to ensure that these telco companies, they contribute to broader social and economic goals and improving digital inclusion and access to technology. But in the case of Starlink, this framework allowed the company to avoid these requirements. So we have like these low licensing fees and the absence of public auction process meant that Starlink didn't have to commit to these social obligations. So this is something that we can tackle. So for instance, right now, Starlink asked to the telecom agency to have approval to put more satellites in the orbit. And this time, the telco agency, they put a public consultation. See, hey guys, for everything, like for the public, hey, what do you think about that? What's your opinions on that? And one specific thing was also related to environmental concerns, because there's a thing related to two things. There is really a concern. First is like sky watching. I don't know, like to observe the sky, not only for like satellites for, I don't know, we have satellites in Brazil that are tracking deforestation in the Amazon. So maybe the satellites from Starlink could harm this visualization. But there's another thing that's not talked too much, but it's related to the importance of the sky to indigenous communities. So the sky is a part of the nature and part of their cosmology. So what are the impacts of putting a bunch of like these little tiny bright lights on the sky? So that is a thing also. And there's the other one, which when the satellites goes down and came back to the land. And we are seeing that like in several parts in Brazil. Until now, there wasn't any damage occurring, but probably it could happen at some point. So the telco agency, they put out this public consultation to analyze that. And that's it. This is not a fight not only for civil society. We put our contributions regarding the fee, licensing, and these environmental impacts. But it was, I don't say funny to see, but other telco operations said, hey, Starlink is paying nothing and we are paying a lot. So it's not fair with the market for Starlink just to pay $20,000 to have a license to operate this whole set of satellites. So answer your question, is that it? I think we should tackle to put more fiber optics and to put more obligation on Starlink so we can ease the burden on the communities to have to solve for themselves the impacts, not only the environmental impacts, but the social impacts that this internet connectivity is bringing to them.
I love what you're saying. I wrote something about the sky watching thing because I find it fascinating. It's like the right to a dark sky, right? Which is something beautiful and that for the communities is like super important. And I also think like you are right, like you have like two things, like regulate better, like Starlink. The agency is called Anatel, right, in Brazil, the one that Anatel should like bring better rules and also like a more competitive environment and to roll out more fiber optics. In this case, like, do you think like rolling out more fiber optics could have the benefit of having different providers or like to break the monopoly that now we have in the Amazon region?
Definitely. And that's what's happened in Brazil a few years ago, because we have these smaller providers of internet and they right now, they provide internet services to more than half of the population, more than the major telcos. And that happened because the telecommunications agency, Anatel, they took out a lot of requirements for these smaller internet providers to operate. And then we had seen a boom on internet connectivity in Brazil after this new regulation on smaller internet providers. So it's really important, specifically because smaller internet providers provide better service than the major ones. So if you live in a capital, so I'm currently based in São Paulo, and during the pandemic, I went to the countryside. And my internet provider in the countryside was way better than my current one. And not only in quality of internet service, but also in quality of customer service. And And if you have the opportunity of putting this fiber optics in the region, you will see not only a boom in internet access, but as I was mentioned, you're going to see a boom on internet providers, on more jobs and more high skills professionals in these regions, because that's what we saw in the countryside of Brazil in the last years. So this is really important. And as I was mentioned, it's not only a problem of economic thing also. It's like a political thing to put all the connectivity in the Amazon in the hands of the Starlink, because now Starlink dominates the market for internet in the Amazon. So it's effectively controlling access to information, economic opportunities, social infrastructures in these communities. And this creates a monopoly where the company, they set the terms, they potentially could increase the prices or even limiting the services because we don't have local alternatives. And then we have to think about also the long run, because this monopoly could deepen inequality and limit the region's ability to develop sustainable and locally controlled digital infrastructure. And then this makes the community vulnerable to external pressures and reducing their ability to make and being more independent. And then we are seeing all these issues regarding X in Brazil, so it's really important to have other options.
Can you just talk a little bit about the X problem in Brazil, and if you see a connection between that and Starlink?
Definitely. So there's a thing that Elon Musk is really closely aligned with figures like Donald Trump, and his control over the connectivity in the Amazon through Starlink, and along with his influence over public discourse on X, it really could lead to significant challenges or even conflict of interest. And this dual control, control of connectivity in the Amazon and control over public discourse on X, gives him a great leverage and potentially allowing him to pressure the Brazilian government, which may right now and in the following years have different political interests from the US administration. So for instance, he could refuse to comply with Brazilian judicial orders, as he's done, or he even could slow down or even cut off internet services to Brazil. And this is particularly concerning because some Brazilian institutions already rely on Starlink. So the Marine in Brazil uses Starlink. Petrobras, which is the state-owned gas and oil company, uses Starlinks, meaning that this dependency could become a political tool. So in this way, both Starlink and X could be used to influence our national sovereignty, not only Brazil, but in any other country where this technology is becoming a critical part of its infrastructure. And just going on the legal challenges that they are facing in Brazil, the Starlink has encountered some hurdles in Brazil with the telecommunications body and with the legal system also. Like the most notable episode occurred in a response to a decision by the Brazil Supreme Federal Court. What happened? This issue arose after Starlink was involved in a broader legal dispute concerning X's failure to comply with a series of judicial orders. So X was demanded to restrict certain user accounts, and they received fines for this non-compliance, and they didn't even appoint a legal representative in Brazil. So what happened was the judge, they froze the assets of Starlink and said, well, if you didn't suspend the access to X, you're going to lose your license to operate in Brazil. So what happened? Starlink responded by stating that it would not comply with the court decisions until the Brazilian authorities resolve this separate issue relating to the freezing of its financial assets. Because what happened was like X ran away from Brazil and they didn't have a representative, they didn't have money in their accounts, so the Brazilian judicial court went after the bank account from Starlink. And Starlink said, well, we're not going to comply with the blocking of X if you didn't free our assets. Because Starlink argued that the freeze imposed by the Supreme Court was done without affording the company an adequate opportunity to defend itself. And this is a violation to the right to due process. And Starlink made really clear that it would only follow the court's order regarding the suspension of X once this financial dispute was resolved. However, besides all the political stance, money talks, right? So Starlink eventually announced that it would comply with the court's ruling, despite the concerns about the legality of the asset that was freezed. And that's it. Like Starlink's action, it could be seen as an external interference in our internal affairs, because they resisted a court order. And the company essentially questioned the country's autonomy in regulating its own territory. And this highlights this growing tension between these global tech giants and national governments, where these multinational companies, they want to attempt to bypass or challenge local regulation and potentially undermine the sovereignty of the nation. Because what's happened in Brazil? It was like they contested the Supreme Court order, and then it gives them a boost to the far-right Congress people here in Brazil, saying, look at the Supreme Court, like censoring the Brazilians. So you create a turmoil, internal turmoil in Brazil and in other countries that they may do that. So that's a problem. And that is the main problem, I guess. It's not only not complying with a court order, but also trying to create this political turmoil in internal affairs of the country.
I mean, it's such a clear example of what we were talking, right? It's not only about like the money and more clients and like the problem of a monopoly, like of increasing prices or whatever. Like it's also the problem, like we know that internet is like a big tool for expressing some rights. So if you have that, and this case represents that X and Starlink are kind of the same. Even if they are like different companies, they are like...
And they're saying, no, we are different companies.
It's crazy.
And there's a funny part, because when Starlink put a public statement saying that they are not related, under the document, there was like this X that goes in every company. So, come on.
Yeah, I mean, it's crazy. They're kind of the same. The interests that, of course, align.
There is this Elon Musk involvement on defending far-right groups in Brazil and his open defiance of Brazilian court orders. It underscores like a broader concern about foreign entities trying to influence the country's internal matter, like these Musk's actions, including his vocal support for Bolsonaro supporters and the refusal to comply with the Brazil judiciary. It really highlights the dangers of allowing a single company, especially one with such political entanglements, to control these vital services like internet connectivity.
We get a lot of listeners from, potentially unsurprisingly, the US and the UK. And I think that there is a bit of a kind of difference in the way that people think about themselves and like the focus on individualism kind of in the US and the UK. And I wondered if you might be able to talk about like the importance, particularly in the Indigenous communities, of that kind of community control or that community identity that maybe we're missing a bit of context.
I don't know, maybe in the US and UK, you see internet connectivity as a service that you pay for it and then you have this service and that's it. And I don't think that for Indigenous communities is the same way. It's not just a thing that we paid and that's it. It's a service that's provided to us. I think it's because we that live under the influence of the Western culture, not only in the global minority and we don't live like in the global majority, but in the capitals. I think they see all these services not as a customer, but as a community, in a community lens, in a citizens lens also, regarding to citizenship, autonomy, and how this influence my rights. Is not just a thing that I buy and someone provides this to me. It's something how this affects my daily life, how this affects my way of living, how this affects my community. So, and that's a thing really important that I forgot to mention. When you wanted to provide the services in the indigenous community, there is this process which is called a consultation protocol. So each community has its own consultation protocol before the government or any company to go to provide something to that, because they have to analyze if it's like benefit for them. And they have a protocol for that. They have like this more nuanced way of dealing with this kind of services and products.
Even like in the net neutrality debate, for example, or like when we talk about like internet as a human right, you are always thinking like, okay, access shouldn't be interrupted, for example. Okay, it's a human right, so you should have always access without no one managing the network in the philosophical debate of net neutrality, of course. And I actually really like what you were saying about like cultural things that makes you want to manage the network, right? Like also some content regulations within the community. And I think that's something difficult to understand from a Western global minority point of view, because the idea it was like internet is a right, like you should decide.
Yeah. I think the right to internet is also related to the right of freedom of expression, which is really different from what we have in Brazil, from what we have like in the US or probably in the UK. It's not an absolute right, like we have to respect some other rights, and then this absolute, almost a dictatorship of freedom of expression above everything is not something that we have here in Brazil. People use this umbrella of freedom of expression to do all kinds of statements and all kinds of bad statements, like racism, sexism, misogyny. And then you just can say, well, it's freedom of expression. And in Brazil, it's kind of different. Like you can say this kind of stuff without having a proper response.
Yeah, it was amazing, Lula. Thank you so much. Really, really enjoyed it.
It was a pleasure.
That was a fantastic discussion, and it actually makes you feel like that an alternative world is possible. And it also makes me wonder if we need to also be talking about this alternative world, not just at this new layer that you've introduced us to, Carla, which is a layer of infrastructure, but also to get back to the content level. And it reminds me a lot of Maria Farrell's excellent essay a few months ago about the rewilding of the internet. And just to bring something banal to the conversation, I was reading an article recently about big food, capital B, capital F. And so these are the people who create ultra-processed food and sell food at lower cost than it has ever existed. And they're worried about the fact that people in America are now using Ozempic and other types of medication that is changing their palates. And so people don't want to eat their unhealthy food anymore. So they're trying to find ways, rather than to fuel that potential healthy pattern of eating, they're trying to do what they've always done, which is to innovate, to try to get people to continue to buy their horrible food, even though that their palates have changed as a result of a drug, which kind of blows my mind. It talks about how chip manufacturers, like as in chips, crisps, they studied people's flavor and what the things that basically make you addicted to food. And they found they had to make crisps louder as you chew them, because that's what makes people want to eat. And so it's not the fault of the consumer who wants to eat better but doesn't. It's like the food's engineering a way to make you want to eat it. And I'll admit, the article had a picture of a Dorito, or a Dorito-like chip that was crumbling, and it was beautifully orange, like unnaturally beautifully orange. And so what was the first thing I did after work yesterday? I went and bought a bag of Doritos. And on the bag of Doritos, it actually had an even crispier recipe as they're advertising. And what did I do with that bag of Doritos? I sat down and ate the whole goddamn thing. So the fault is in our stars and not just in ourselves, right?
Totally.
And so even if we can imagine a different world, the capital B, capital F, or a capital B, capital T, big tech, big food, they're going to shift with this and pretend that they're the good people, that they're on the side of freedom and access and all these types of things. And I just love hearing that the world could be otherwise. And all we need is competition regulators and others to step in and help us make this happen. Right, Caitlin?
Yes. And if you aren't over competition and you just want more competition, then we actually have another podcast entirely on competition called No Competition, Big Tech, Big Problems, because we're really good at naming things, with a competition expert called Dr. Denis Manzari. So yeah, if you're interested in hearing more about competition, then go check out that podcast.
Carla, thanks so much for joining us. This was a great discussion, and I can't wait to do and see more on it.
Thank you both. It was great to be here.
Thanks for listening. You can sign up to be the first to learn more about our work at pvcy.org/podsignup. And we'll include some links to relevant articles and information in the description wherever you're listening or on our website at pvcy.org/techpill. And we'll also include a nice piece that was written specifically on vertical mergers that's on our website. Don't forget to rate and subscribe to the podcast on whichever platform you use. Music courtesy of Sepia. This podcast was produced by Max Burnell for Privacy International.